Good morning. I know that I'm in an unenviable position standing between you and the network break. So just bear with me for a few more minutes, and I promise we'll have a great networking break and with coffee and everything that has already been lined up. I'm Rana Sen. I've been working with state, local, and government agencies over the last 20 years. And of late, taken on a role of leading our smart city and state local transportation practice. And we heard a lot of insightful discussions over the last couple of days, yesterday and this morning, about many of the issues, the imperatives that seem to be converging today, actually. We heard about unprecedented urbanization, where 1.3 or 1.5 million people are moving into cities every week, and how we're going to add or double the population in urban areas in the next 30 years. We heard about CO2 emissions, and that 3/4 of those emissions are coming from urban geographies today. We heard about safety. I mean, my colleague Rahul, who coordinated a panel yesterday afternoon, and the panel talked about 40,000 deaths every year, fatalities, pedestrian deaths, gave me pause. If you really think about it, and if you assume that a commercial aircraft has about 300 people, carries about 300 people, that's about 133 aircrafts being downed every year, right? Just to put that in perspective. Civic engagement, smartphone devices, our activities of daily living, our engagement with online services. We are moving away from a product mindset to a services mindset. We are looking for engagement with our governments, not just a service delivery. And then disruptions, and through technologies. And this is an interesting one because when we go into conferences and we have discussions around all things smart, this is top of mind for everyone. And it just seems that there's a lot going on, and which is true. We are in a time, in an era when there are a lot of new technologies emerging. Some of the technologies have matured, and there is, at times it feels that there's a tsunami going on. One other thing, though, that I would like to mention in this context is this notion of disruptive technology, right? Innovations have been happening for years, and let me provide you an example. In the late 1800s is when the first automobile was manufactured, right? It was an innovation. However, was it a disruptive innovation? Probably not. It was not until 1908, I believe, or 1910, when Ford did the mass market manufacturing of automobiles, and which really impacted the market around horse-drawn carriages, did it become disruptive. So a lot of these issues and imperatives and the technologies that we are seeing today, we have to look at it from a lens around what is disruptive today versus tomorrow, and then obviously plan accordingly. So with that being said, there's obviously a lot of anticipation, but the good thing is that there's a lot of enthusiasm, excitement, if you will, for the future on how we can really harness all of this for the common good. And what I would submit to you is, let's talk about a construct that would help empower us and the cities and everyone else to initiate, to identify, to prioritize this complex set of moving parts, of moving components, if you will, that constitute all things smart at a smart city level, smart community, smart state. And the constructs that I'm going to touch upon today are three. Number one, systemic. Two, resiliency. And number three, human-centric. And there were some conversations that happened yesterday, even today, which I'm just heartened to kind of know that that is now in our conversations day in, day out, about being people-centric, about putting the constituent first. And in my mind, they can mean different things. And what I'm going to show you right now are just two sort of specific examples to make it real, to understand what human centricity really means. So here is the first one. Many of you probably have encountered this sign in many cities, right? And I acknowledge that this is an evolution of parking policies and regulations over time. But nonetheless, it's still confusing when you go around looking for a parking spot. So here is the version 2 of that. So a young designer in a city took upon herself to redesign this, the parking signs. And this is what she came up with. And the city actually adopted this and has started installing it all around the city. I bring it up because this is not a technology solution in terms of human centricity. This is about the experience. And when we think about engaging with the constituent, engaging with the resident, let's also keep that in mind, that at one end of the spectrum, there could be non-technology solutions about the experience, and that lens should be applied as well when you think about different ways of engaging with the residents. On the other end of the spectrum, I'll give you another example where this is more at a high level of abstraction. People receive unemployment benefits, are eligible to receive unemployment benefits. And I think a couple of years ago, my data says that about 15 million people filed for such benefits. Now, most of these people are good people. They are receiving this and applying for this because they are out of jobs. But there is also this issue that nearly 1 out of 8 dollars distributed by the states go to recipients who are not eligible for those benefits. Okay? So the problem remains. And this is not because of intentional fraudulent behavior. A lot of this can be attributed to misunderstanding of the appeal process or filling out a form incorrectly. But given this context, there is one solution or enforcement. But let's take a quick look at the video, and then I'll come back to and explain why this is important from a human-centric standpoint.
Meet Eric. Eric was fired from his job as a line cook for being late for the second time in 1 week. Management didn't seem to really care why he was late, even though Eric thought he could supply perfectly legitimate reasons. And this is Karen. Karen was laid off from her job 3 months ago due to staff cutbacks. Fortunately, she was able to start collecting unemployment benefits while she looked for a new job. After a while, she decided to settle on a temporary job at 20 hours a week until a full-time position opened up. Karen is well aware that if she reports any income at this time, her benefits will take a drastic fall, putting her in a pretty tight spot. George here lost his job when the local paper downsized, freeing him up to focus on that novel he's always wanted to write. Sure, he meets the requirements for job searching. Just the other day, he saw a posting for a promising new opportunity. Looking at these examples, we begin to understand the nature of the problem confronting state and federal agencies. Traditionally, the solution has been to amp up resources to prosecute low-level cases of fraud, which is not only expensive, but risks withholding benefits from those who need them most. So the DWS turned to behavioral economics to see what the latest science could offer. Nudge theory argues that positive reinforcement and indirect suggestion can be more effective than direct instruction, legislation, and enforcement. By simply making a few smart, subtle changes to the claimant's experience, the DWS could drastically improve the 3 key areas that led our friends astray. Displaying a copy of a preloaded letter addressed to Eric's ex-employer, verifying whether he was fired or laid off, provided just enough accountability to nudge him toward the more honest answer. Notifying Karen that 9 out of 10 people report all new income was enough to encourage her to report that check that's on its way. And by asking George to commit to a specific job search goal next week, we see an increase of follow-through, which leads to an increase in his chances of finding a new job. Using these 3 simple nudges, the New Mexico DWS was able to deliver solutions that made claimants twice as likely to report new earnings, half as likely to commit fraud, and up to 20% more likely to find work within the next few months.
So this is important in terms of bringing in behavioral science into the fold, because it's not just about the metrics or the performance measures, right? I think the video articulated that it's twice as likely to report new earnings, 50% reduction in fraudulent behavior, and 20% likelihood of getting jobs sooner. The issue over here is, and the manifestation really is about the intersection of empathy and design. It's walking in somebody else's shoes. It's walking in the shoes of George and Karen, and then designing a system and a process around it, which is human centricity. So when we talk about being digital, it's quite distinct from digitization, because it's not necessarily putting a form online. It's really looking at it a bit more holistically and figuring out what needs to be done to address the specific issue. A couple other things as well, and I'll get to the 2 other dimensions because I'm running out of time as well. One other thing I would like to mention over here is this notion of inclusion, and there's obviously various attributes to that. But one thing for sure also, when it comes to this aspect of human centricity, one example that comes to mind, I just want to relate to you, is 311 system that was implemented by Fort Wayne, in the city of Fort Wayne. And I know San Antonio has begun that journey as well. One of the things that they discovered is that once they did that, a lot of the calls were still coming in from analog lines, landlines that some neighborhoods already had. And that behavior was not changing. So the approach that they took was not to do a replacement, but to be inclusive of that technology as well, where the data was being obviously pulled into one integrated platform, but the channels were still varied. How many of you have heard of the Day Zero problem in Cape Town, South Africa? Just a couple. In early 2015, they noticed and they came and recognized that if they don't do something about it, the city of Cape Town, they would run out of water in 2018. Just think about it. A major city running out of water supply completely. Okay. In early 2018, they also recognized that if they don't do something really drastic, they would run out of water in June of 2018. So obviously, then they have been taking some actions, but then it was sort of switched to full gear. And what they did was manifold, relating back to the behavioral science examples that I provided you with. They started taking a look at some of the social norms and how that can encourage some of the behaviors. So they introduced a water map that highlights the water consumption in different neighborhoods and nudge people to use water accordingly. They introduced this notion of social recognition. People who consumed water less than the target, they were recognized by the city. Okay? They introduced this notion of real-time feedback. They provided transparency into what the water levels were in the different reservoirs and the tanks, and for encouraging people to then obviously modify their behaviors accordingly. And community groups started collaborating because there were elderly and other people who might not be able to travel to access points for water, so that they can help each other out. And that's the second theme that I want to submit to you in terms of resiliency. When we talk resiliency, we think about utilities, we think about environment, but there's the social resilience aspect that is also quite integral to way we should look at some of the smart city initiatives. And obviously, the security part, with cyber being front and center, being secure in terms of risk prioritized access controls, being vigilant in looking at threat intelligence and situational awareness and planning for that are aspects around the second theme. And then thirdly, this notion of systemic, which essentially says, of systems or system of systems, which I really think what a smart city or community is. It is not just a single system. You have innovations that are happening. You have different point solutions. But you also then at the same time have to think about what that integrated platform is, what that approach is around making sure that the point solutions have connectivity between them, have some level of convergence. So you don't stifle innovation, but you bring it together. You think about data and how data can be broken down between different silos for informed decision making. I'll give an example. In the city of Cascais, a medium-size city sitting right outside Lisbon, they, over the last couple of years, have implemented a really advanced public transit multimodal system. So it's across bus, train, scooters, ride-hailing services, and they have served that information up through an integrated platform. They have also created one seamless card that you can use for payment purposes or your mobile app. Now, they didn't stop there. They started then looking at the other domain areas around energy and environment and waste management. And then they installed the IoT sensors in their recycling bins, the trash collection bins. And when you look at that data, then you start combining that data with the real-time traffic management data, combine that with your road construction data. It was not just about optimal routing of the trash collection trucks. It was also about making sure when the best time would be to collect that. And the outcomes were that they had an energy savings, anticipated energy savings about 20%, and a reduction in operational costs of about 40%. So ultimately, that kind of proves the benefit of having this integrated approach, a systemic approach, which is distinct. And on another note, I also want to mention that there's a lot of talk about data. We had some really insightful conversations about data this morning as well and yesterday. And there are two aspects to this. I'm not going to go into the conversation about data trust because that's a very important and significant topic where we need to have more conversations on. But there is this notion of open data versus integrated data. And I do understand that cities, communities, governments have a social mission, a responsibility around transparency, accountability, and providing open data sets in an anonymized or aggregated fashion. But there is also this need for an integrated approach to data, to bring together precise data sets to help ensure that the use cases or the objectives are being met rather than developing point solutions. So I'd like to leave you with some of the lessons learned over here. A couple of things I would like to highlight. One is communication. And again, it was great to hear from multiple speakers about the necessity for communicating at all levels and engaging the citizens. And I just want to reinforce that. We are seeing that across multiple cities as well. Boston, for example, has a Better Blocks initiative. They also have a City Hall to Go truck that they take to neighborhoods for conversations and bring it back into an organized forum. And lastly, this notion of an ecosystem. I represent private sector, although I've been working with government clients for the last 20 years. And I do believe to resolve these gnarly issues around smart, quote unquote, it needs an ecosystem play. It needs a triple helix between academia, public sector, inclusive of nonprofits, and private sector. And facilitating that conversation is what I will urge all of us to do. With that, thank you so much for listening.